Starting. Hello, this is a special Spur of the Moment Mad Philosopher podcast with our special guest. Would you mind introducing yourself, guest?
Hi, this is my son, Colby. And
hello, Colby.
Chris Duffel. I'm live in Houston.
Well, welcome to the show, Chris. You may or may not know, since we just met on Facebook a matter of moments ago, I live in Denver, Colorado. So we're not too far apart. We're in the same time zone, at least.
Yeah.
So our special discussion today is regarding Bitcoin and its relationship to the Catholic faith, which, interestingly enough, there is an intersection between those two worlds. And that's something that we're going to explore today. So I guess Chris is going to ask me some questions and we're going to have a conversation from there.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could begin by kind of briefly explaining the origins, both technically and socially, around Bitcoin in particular, as a kind of case. And one moment, I'm here for just a second. My son just woke up from his nap.
Yeah, I understand how that goes.
Technical origins and kind of socially how it relates to the '08 crash.
Okay.
Maybe context.
That sounds good. So the kind of legend or mythos, the history behind cryptocurrency is centered around an pseudonymous individual named Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know male, female. We don't know if it was a group of people or a individual. All indications lead to it's somebody of East Asian descent who goes by the name Satoshi as a moniker, given his grasp of the English language and his white paper and such. Technically proficient, but not the best programmer in the world. But he had a certain idea that he wanted to see manifested. And so he wrote the white paper in the original code for what is now called Bitcoin. Satoshi is still yet unknown. Is that correct? Correct. There have been a couple people that the media have grabbed onto and said, "Oh, we found a Satoshi," and there's very little evidence that they ever actually succeeded in doing so. So yes, Satoshi is still anonymous for all intents and purposes. In the white paper itself and in the conversations on forums and stuff that he had regarding his white paper, it's very clear that he is also of anarchist disposition, such as myself. He had this idea that the '08 housing crisis was a result of illicit financial practices by government and national banks. And so he wanted to create a modern currency that operated very similar to the way gold did in the past, but was independent of any sovereign state so that it could help usher in a economically free society, basically. So that was kind of his utopian ideal for his very real, tangible, technical creation. Yeah, so can you, I think that helps give a nice, hey, I need you to be quiet, I'm talking, okay? Sorry. Oh, it's no problem. Can you talk briefly about blockchain and some of the technical features of cryptocurrencies that allow it to be that, say, wouldn't allow this to happen prior to them existing? Sure. The way that currency has primarily operated in the past, you've had tangible units of exchange, right? You have a gold coin. Kind of hung up there. Did I lose you or did you lose me? Hey, you're back. So okay. You began with talking about the kind of, I guess, fundamentals of what currency is to begin with the coin, the gold backup. Okay, so yeah, the individual physical units of currency get passed around, and what Satoshi tried to do in creating Bitcoin is create a digital facsimile, where he analyzes the functionality that currency has historically, and tries to create a digital copy. And the way that he accomplished this was through creating what's called a blockchain, which, as simply as I can put it, is a ledger that keeps track of the location of every unit of Bitcoin in existence. So there's a list of addresses, and there's a list of Bitcoin that belongs to those addresses. In this way, you have basically a centralized reference for any one location. So rather than actually holding a physical object in my hand, what I have is access to a particular address, which is accomplished through cryptographic methods. And then that address has money on it. It's similar, very broadly speaking, it's similar to the way that modern bank accounts work, where it's a number in a database is all that my bank account is. And then that number in the database has a certain value assigned to it that represents the amount of money I have in my bank account. There's not necessarily a stash of dollars in a vault somewhere that relates directly to my account.
Right.
The thing that makes the blockchain special or resilient, that makes it different than a bank account, is rather than the bank tracking a specific document and using that as their ledger for all of their accounts, what Bitcoin does is it distributes that ledger across the entire network. So there's literally hundreds of thousands of copies of that ledger in existence, and they're all cross-referenced against each other in order to prevent fraud. If I change my blockchain to say something different than everybody else's blockchain, my blockchain gets voted off or my block gets voted off the blockchain because it's nefarious, basically.
So I have a question regarding that. It seems like in principle, the only way that you could actually try to maliciously or nefariously change the kind of underlying blockchain would be to change all of them at once, simultaneously. And that's, effectively near impossible to do. So that's the kind of defense mechanism, right?
Yes, it's a little more technically precise than that, but generally speaking, that is the case. There is a theoretical attack on Bitcoin called the 51% attack, which is basically if you take over 51% of the network and the ledgers and all of that, you could begin making malicious blocks on the blockchain. But again, 51% of the total network is a huge amount of processing and memory power that most people wouldn't have access to.
Yeah. So the ledger is actually, there's a copy that is encrypted, but there's a copy on every person's machine who has some Bitcoin. Is that correct?
More or less. There are some technologies in what we call wallet technology, which is the way that you access those addresses, that allow them to only use bits and pieces of the blockchain as opposed to the full multi-gigabyte document. For instance, on my phone, I have an app that tracks my wallet, and I don't have a complete copy of the blockchain on my phone because at this point it would take up more than half of the memory on my phone. Yeah. So on my phone, it has just enough pieces of it to be able to do its job, but not the whole document. On my computer, on my desktop, the machine I'm using right now, I do have a full copy of the blockchain in operation. I actually have multiple copies of multiple blockchains for different cryptocurrencies running on my machine right now.
So for you personally right now, is your investment in this space something more like a stock that you just sort of buy and watch it as it's growing, or are you actually using it day to day and purchasing things?
Because I've always kind of approached it from a hobbyist angle, I'm a little bit of everything, which is a little bit difficult to keep track of in my head at times. When I first started in the cryptocurrency space, it was back in 2010, fairly early on. I was one of those guys that spent all of his time on the internet. So I was on 4chan, I was on the Tor network, I was on all these different things. For better or for worse, I know the best and the worst that the internet has to offer. So at that time, I was in it just for a hobby. I didn't believe in the currency as something that could be successful. And actually, at the time, I was a dyed a diehard Trotskyite Marxist. So I wasn't a big fan of economics either. So I was approaching it from the angle of, oh, this is a really cool technology. And if our enlightened communist overlords ever come into power and build a robot to run the Marxist economy, this blockchain stuff might actually work really well. So that was my kind of hobbyist angle on the whole, on the whole mess. So I was radically divergent from Satoshi in philosophical ideology. I spent all of the Bitcoin that I mined at the time. It's another one of those stories that if I had kept all of it, I would probably be, well, actually, Bitcoin's about to break 2,900 today. So I would literally be a millionaire if I had kept all my Bitcoin early on. So that's unfortunate. Since then, I kind of lost track of it for a bunch of different reasons. Just my life got out of control. And since then, I've learned economics, and now I'm an anarcho-capitalist. So I'm more in the vein of Satoshi Nakamoto. And now I have Bitcoin again. I'm participating in the crypto economy. And I have a store of Bitcoins and alternative cryptocurrencies that I use as a store of value against inflation. So it's kind of a speculative investment. You know, I bought some at 200 and now it's 2,900. So it's doing a lot better than Federal Reserve notes with regards to hedging against inflation. It's doing better than gold or silver in that regard. Then I have some that I spend on a kind of daily or monthly basis. I buy video games with Bitcoin. I buy goods and services from random people. My family's primary care physician takes Bitcoin. And so I pay him in Bitcoin out of some sort of kind of activist agenda. It's like, oh, well, the more people we get to use Bitcoin, the more resilient the network is. So I'm going to get my doctor to use Bitcoin. So now my doctor uses Bitcoin.
Do you find that these people have a kind of accurate understanding day to day of what a Bitcoin is worth, or do you always have to say, a Bitcoin, oh, it's worth, you know, $2,900 or something like that?
So Bitcoin finds its price the same way anything else in the world finds its price. It's an emergent property of buying and selling. It's an emergent property of the market. It's called the price finding mechanism. So at any given point in time, the generally accepted value of Bitcoin could be anything. Right now, it's approaching 2,900 according to the exchanges that are out there that are buying and selling Bitcoin for people. I could probably get my hands on Bitcoin for cheaper than that, and I could probably sell it for more than that if I find the right buyers and sellers. So it's kind of an average of what people are willing to accept more than a really concrete price. You know, when you go to the grocery store, a can of tuna fish is $1.25 or $1 or $4, whatever it may be. That's because the store says so. But the store says so because that's a competitive price relative to what everybody else is buying and selling tuna fish at.
So when you say pay your primary care physician in Bitcoin, is he, you know, referring to some sort of third party that would give you an accurate assessment? Or, I mean, it's in some way removed from the dollar. So I'm trying to see like how you would use it day to day, and the rate at which the dollar seems to fluctuate seems to be less variable than a Bitcoin. So
to all appearances, you are correct, right? A dollar today is roughly as valuable as a dollar tomorrow, generally speaking, on the market.
Sure.
It goes up and down a little bit. Bitcoin is all over the place. One day it'll be up 200, the next day it'll be down 200. So the way that my primary care physician does it right now is he uses Coinbase, which is a web-based exchange service. And Coinbase is one of the primary trackers of the price of Bitcoin. And so his value of Bitcoin is pegged to Coinbase's value for Bitcoin. So, you know, today I'd be giving him a lot less Bitcoin than I would have been giving him several months ago when it was down at 400. There was something else I wanted to say about that, but I lost my train of thought. So.
Yeah. So actually on that end, with all of the what I've recently come to find out is ICOs, initial coin offerings, similar to IPOs. Why, given the seeming uptick in all of these sort of things, why would you not, you know, dump a little bit of money in everything that comes out? Because it seems like the potential payoff, like I was looking yesterday at the Ethereum price 4 months ago, and it was like 16 bucks, and now it's like 250, 260. And I know there's not a linear trend, and you can never expect that, but it seems like there's mostly upsides in these things if you're willing to gamble a little bit. Do you see most of these actually gaining traction, or do you think there will be a few main players in this space in the near future?
So the easy analogy that people like to use is the cryptocurrency space today is comparable to the internet in 1996. It's very early in its development. In 1996, you have a couple companies that have kind of entered into that commercial internet space, and they kind of dominated the whole thing in their environment. But now, where's America Online today, right? Nobody uses AOL anymore. Yeah. And that's for good reason, right? So in the same way, in the cryptocurrency space, it's distinctly possible that Bitcoin is the AOL of the cryptocurrency space. They're the first one in there. They're really doing their thing. Everybody used them, but give it a decade and we'll see. Maybe Zcash, maybe Ethereum, maybe Litecoin, maybe something that hasn't been written yet will be the dominant, will be the Google of the internet.
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's a good analogy.
So as far as investment strategy goes, I'm not anybody that has authority on that subject, but I do think that if you were to buy a little bit of every alt currency that's out there, the likelihood of a successful payout is somewhat small because a lot of those currencies fluctuate wildly in value and then cease to exist. So it'd be similar to buying every new stock offering on the market and expecting to make a total net gain. You at best probably going to break even. You're going to have a couple companies that do really well, and then the rest are going to eat up all of the revenue. And so it's kind of a toss-up.
Sure. So do you think in the next, say, 5 to 10 years that in the average American's life, actually there's not even a really good way to put that, in my life, so I've started recently getting interested in studying Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies over the past month, so pretty new. So someone who hasn't done anything before, like myself, and has just recently started reading about it, when something hits Tim Ferriss' podcast, it sort of begins to become mainstream. Do you see it affecting many people, or do you think it's still kind of in the early bleeding edge adopter phase?
So already today, cryptocurrency at large has dramatically impacted the average man's life, and they're just not aware of it. Some of it has to do with just the way that the government views capital gains. Some of it has to do with the way that the global community views national reserve currencies. Banks now are implementing blockchain technology for various applications outside the cryptocurrency space. They're using US dollars, but they're using blockchains for different type of security and verification and things like that. Of course, on the front end, on the user-facing end, most people don't even know what Bitcoin is. So it's kind of, depending on what you mean by influencing people's lives, the answer is either, yes, it's already happened, or we'll just have to wait and see, depending on what you mean.
Sure. Yeah, it's like that line, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed.
Yeah.
Sure. Let's see, I had some other questions typed up here. So is there an easy way, or maybe not easy, but is there a simple heuristic that we could use for distinguishing the differences between different types of cryptocurrencies? Because I know that, at least in principle, the way different dollar valuations work in the United States and other types of currencies around the world are sort of tied to a nation, and they regulate their values. But the cryptocurrencies are in principle something that are supranational or transnational, so they're not really tied to a nation's interest. They're more tied to an idea about how money could flow between people. So they seem to vary more in terms of their technical implementation rather than their national allegiance. Can you talk about how you could compare maybe the leading few cryptocurrencies and how we can start to think about their differences?
Most definitely. There's actually an even more interesting question hidden in there, but we'll address that one first.
Sure. Okay.
So an easy heuristic, there's kind of two ways to approach it. One is from the technological aspect and the other is from an economic aspect, right? Okay. This is a perfect melding of technology and economics, which is right in my wheelhouse. When we're talking about the technology side of things, most cryptocurrency developers release some form of white paper where they go, here's the fundamentals of what we're creating, here's the general structure of the program we're planning on writing, this is the ultimate goal of the product. And in there you can find different things that, if you understand the language, you can kind of understand what they're trying to do. Proof of work versus proof of stake, I'm trying to think of other things, initial coin offerings versus just straight up mining creation, different things like that. And that kind of gives you an idea of the technological fundamentals. It'll give you an idea about whether or not the technology is sound. Typically, some sort of pseudonymous program which operates within proof of work using some sort of encryption along the lines of like SHA-256 or whatever.
Sure.
Those tend to be...
I want to pause you just for a moment. Can you define all of the words that you just said in that last sentence? The proof of work, first of all, I'm familiar with it, but can you define proof of work?
Most definitely. I'm not the best person to talk to about this, but usually the best people to talk to about that already have much more popular podcasts out there. One I would point to would be Let's Talk Bitcoin. I've recently stopped listening to them in like the last year or so, just because I got bored listening to the same sort of technology talk over and over and over. There wasn't very much happening in the crypto space at the time. So I kind of lost interest, but it's still a great place to join in and start learning all of the fundamentals, as well as some of the exciting technical things going on at the time. But proof of work, generally speaking, the way that the blockchain is secured, the way that we know that each block on the chain is legitimate, is there's a whole array of computers called mining rigs or mining computers that are doing very complicated cryptographical and mathematical processes, basically trying to guess a number that's one out of a huge amount of numbers based on cryptographic and mathematical principles. So you have an algorithm, it's the mining algorithm, and it takes a lot of work for that algorithm to run. So you have a set of chips that require power, they generate heat, there's a bunch of different things that they do, they work, and they try to guess this number. And by the magic of cryptography and programming, I don't want to get too complicated, but by the power of cryptography and computing, that secures that block, because you have a bunch of computers all doing that at the same time, and they basically have to agree on the answer. At the same time, they're also adding that block to the blockchain while doing all of that complicated math. So proof of work is basically guessing that number proves that you did the work to guess the number. And then it uses different encryption algorithms. So I go, okay, here's the result, it's encrypted this way. Here's your result, it's encrypted this way. The encrypted results match, so it's a match. Proof of stake is a little bit different in that it's more, rather than doing processor intensive work, you do a sort of voting process that the machines run through. And the more of that asset that you have, I forget the currency that I used to be really involved in that had it, and I've Dark Coin used to run on proof of stake. And the idea behind that was the more Dark Coin you have, the more stake you have in the system operating properly. And so you basically get to vote which block is authoritative, which opens itself to issues, but there are cryptographical backends on that prevent somebody from just getting a majority of the Dark Coin and then saying it all belongs to me. Sure. Besides just the economic principle that if I had all of the money, then the money is valueless because nobody wants my money. So there's a couple different guards against corruption, I guess is a word that you would use. You deal with things like proof of stake.
So what was the embedded, more interesting question you had referenced earlier?
So when you're talking about the national currencies, today it gets complicated because it's all tied to reserve banking, right? You have the Federal Reserve, you have the international monetary funds, things like that. And it's all, for lack of a better word, it's all imaginary money, right? In the past, coins used to be backed by the value of the metal that they were made out of. Today, the US dollar is backed up by the US federal government's willingness to blow somebody up over not accepting US Federal Reserve notes. So it's a little more intangible than gold or silver. You can't touch it the same way. So we're talking about gold and silver. The individual kings or the individual parliaments or whatever can take that chunk of gold, that 1 ounce of gold, and stamp their image on it and say, okay, this is one gold coin. I say it's that because it has my stamp on it. It's official. Okay. But if I take a franc and I go to Spain, right, I can melt down that coin and put a new stamp on it, and it's still 1 ounce of that resource. It's still 1 ounce. Sure. It just has a different king's stamp on it. A different king has that mark of approval. So Bitcoin is similar in that the network is backing it up. And so the Bitcoin is like the underlying material that the coins are made out of, more than it is any specific coin. Where in the modern era, we don't really have an easy comparison because the US dollar is the Federal Reserve's product. The euro is the European Union's product. There is no underlying material that it draws its value from, or its hedge of its value from. So that's kind of just an interesting thing to think about, where it's more a move back to traditional understandings of money, even though it's by far and away much more technologically advanced.
Yeah. So what do you, before I get into the directly talking about Catholic related things, what do you think is the biggest hindrance to mass adoption? Like if you had to change one central thing, what do you think would most expeditiously bring upon Bitcoin being as ubiquitous as the dollar or any other type of currency?
That's a really good question, and it ties very closely into one that I've been struggling with for a number of years now, coming from that anarchist angle, which is there seems to be a tragedy of the commons taking place in that we still have a government, right? I don't believe in political authority. I have issues with government for a bunch of different reasons, which tends to grate on some Catholics' nerves, but I argue that it is rationally consistent. Where was I going with that? Oh, but so the tragedy of the commons as applies to government also applies to the adoption of non-government currency. Why haven't people adopted Bitcoin? And the two easy answers I've come across so far is, the first is convenience. It's much easier to live your life the way you're currently living it than it is to radically alter the way you're doing things. I know my credit card has a certain line of value. It's backed up by Visa or MasterCard or whatever. I have my bank account. It has my Federal Reserve currency in it. I know how that works because it's worked the same way ever since I was a baby. And so to learn a whole new technology, to learn a whole new way of thinking about money, to learn about the different, and I remember the thing I forgot earlier, but to learn about the different relative values between currencies and goods and services and things like that. You know, Bitcoin fluctuates wildly relative to the dollar. So to get used to something that fluctuates more than the dollar appears to fluctuate is a lot of work. So that's the first reason, is it's just too much work. The second reason is Bitcoin has very specific applications that is very good at, and then otherwise it's average at best. And so unless you're actively looking to use that specific set of applications that it's good at, the Federal Reserve notes are better or equal to, and it requires less work to learn. And so a lot of cryptocurrency buffs don't want to admit that, because cryptocurrency is the end all be all. But there are issues with it, right? I have to learn how to use a wallet. If I lose my encryption key to my wallet, I lose all of the money in the wallet. There are risks associated with it. So unless I have a good reason to get involved in cryptocurrency, there's no good reason to get involved in cryptocurrency.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, the incentive structure is something that I'm curious about. Like if there's a big enough incentive, people will, join the ship. And the question for me is, when the incentives of remaining in your current state of life and the current way of using money, and in your case, engaging directly with the government, when those incentives tip over, then people will start using it. And at this point, I don't know that I have a strong preference either way. If anything, I tend to have an acute interest in many, many things and a general ignorance of them at the same time. So it's like square in the crosshairs of one of those like really, really interesting things that, it's just fascinating for a number of reasons. So let's get straight into church things, if you're okay with it. Like,
most definitely.
Do you think that what are like the inherent advantages or disadvantages of like giving to the church in Bitcoin? Like, can that be a thing that's maybe a better question is, what value does Bitcoin have in giving that any other currency would not have?
So there's 3 points that I can think of off the top of my head. The first is that Bitcoin is really good at leaving a paper trail if you want it to. Because every Bitcoin is tracked on the ledger at any given point in time, you have to know exactly where it is and where it's been for it to operate properly. So for better or for worse, there has historically been issues with fraud in the church. Money going places that it's not supposed to, or in ways that's inadvisable. Even if it is legitimate, it's still not the best way of dealing with the money. This creates a paper trail for both the administration of the church. I won't call it the magisterium, because the magisterium deals with more important things like morality and ethics and stuff than it does payroll. But the administrators of the church can track what the subsidious parishes and dioceses and everybody are doing from a top-down perspective. And then from a bottom-up perspective, the parishioners can see where the money is going as well. It just lends itself to that transparency in a way that Federal Reserve notes can't. You have to build an entire meta layer of data processing on top of that money to track it. The second one that is beneficial is the church doesn't have a currency of its own. For better or for worse. You could go either way on that one. Yeah. But in the past, again, the Pope has issued currencies. And again, it was in gold and silver, copper, iron. They've issued all sorts of different coins in the past. And those coins were tied to the value of the metals that they were made out of, the same way any other coin was at the time. And again, that gives the church a certain amount of independence from any given nation state. As it currently stands, if the church holds most of its liquid assets in the IMF currencies, and then something were to happen, say China and America go to war and the IMF falls apart, then the church loses a great amount of its wealth that it was relying on in order to carry out its mission in the world, where Bitcoin is one hedge against an IMF collapse. So it kind of helps do the same thing we have with the Vatican and Rome, right?
Sure,
the Vatican is an independent state that exists within Rome, not because the church needs to be a state, but because the church needs to be independent from other states.
So I have a question about that.
Okay.
Speaking of independence, pros and cons to the church developing their own cryptocurrency and
Okay, so in the past, there have been national experiments with cryptocurrency. The one that I like to point to the most, mostly just because it was one of the first ones and because I know the most about it as opposed to other ones, is Iceland tried to create Aurora coin, and it's still kind of in existence, but it never really took off. And they actually did what's called an airdrop, which is like an initial coin offering, but rather than investment, they just give out the currency to everyone. Yeah. So everybody in Iceland got like 20,000 Aurora coins or something like that. And the idea was to create a national currency that was tied to a blockchain so that you couldn't have counterfeiting, for example, because there are monetary issues in Iceland right now as a result of its relationship with international banks. So they were trying to kind of escape that. It was a national project, and it was successful in some ways, but ultimately it never took off. There was the network effect that it ran afoul of. I can see one pro of the church doing that is there are a great many people in the church that are impoverished, right? In the first world, it's really easy to be like, oh, well, you know, we help the poor people, we give sandwiches to the bum on the street, we have soup kitchens, we have all these different programs that we do. But because we're Amerocentric, we forget that there are people starving to death in Africa because the food just simply doesn't exist. And so the church works internationally, but at the same time, people work locally. If the church were to issue a sort of global Catholic currency by some very specifically managed technological process to make sure there's not very much fraud going on, as the value of that coin increases in the developed world, it will also increase in the developing or underdeveloped world. And so it's a way to gently redistribute wealth in a way that's non-coercive, which is really important to me, that it's non-coercive. I don't really care about the redistribution of wealth, to be completely honest. I would rather not do that. But coming at it from a Catholic angle, it is a form of charity if people are willing to engage in a currency that will gently elevate others, will gently elevating us a little bit slower, just because of that comparative difference in bargaining power. So that is an advantage that the church has. Several disadvantages I could think of is it adds one more layer of bureaucracy that the church is dealing with, which may or may not be a good thing given our current political climate within the church. Another one is Bitcoin already exists, so why not just use the existing technology as opposed to trying to create something that does almost exactly the same thing but slightly different? It would make more sense just to start accepting and dealing in existing cryptocurrencies.
I think like the value proposition there would not be that it is a cryptocurrency, because the value in the cryptocurrencies are like you said, the fact that it's encrypted, that it's distributed, and that there is no sort of centralized either like banking system that's being regulated or like Federal Reserve. But I mean, I imagine one thing that the church has in spades is its coverage around the world, right? So you could say if you wanted to distribute something instantly everywhere, like there's a mechanism in place for doing that. So I can imagine a scenario as if I could be so bold as to create a scenario, the church creates a coin. They distribute a certain number of them to every bishop and every diocese, and they decide how to distribute it inside of that area. And then instantaneously, you have a global currency that is less backed by a Federal Reserve and more the mechanism of distribution around the world seems to be like one of the main benefits to cryptocurrency, because it's not decentralized. So then at that point, one of the two advantages seems to be pretty well in place. And then it's a matter of, like you said, the bureaucracy is a pretty big deal. Adding an entire like financial control layer on top of that, but it's not about control. Once it's distributed, it seems like it's fundamentally free from a lot of the top-down mechanisms. Like Bitcoin isn't controlled in a typical sense, right?
Correct. The way that Bitcoin is regulated or controlled right now is the miners are all running the same program. So whenever there's a change in the program, the way that has to be implemented is a certain number of the miners, or rather a certain amount of the processing power on the network, the people doing the proof of work, have to switch to the new program. So I could write my own implementation of Bitcoin and put it out there, but it wouldn't do anything unless a majority of the miners start using my implementation as opposed to the mainstream implementation. So it's almost, but not really, a democratic process by which the miners vote with their processing power.
So a miner is someone who has a Bitcoin?
No, a person who has a Bitcoin is a person who has a Bitcoin. Okay. A miner is the person who's processing the network and actually adding blocks to the ledger.
Adding blocks.
So what I have right now is I just have the ledger, and it updates on a routine basis. Whenever a new block is added, my computer downloads the new block and adds it to the existing document. But the miners are the ones that are actually adding that block onto the ledger. Yeah. So that was kind of the third downside I see to the church trying to implement a kind of Catholic cryptocurrency, is that somebody needs to be doing that mining. Somebody needs to do the processing. Given that the church has an interesting blend of centralization and subsidiarity, I'm not sure how exactly the church would ultimately implement that mining process, but I'm inclined to believe that the only way that they could successfully get the network effect to take place would be to first build a giant server farm in the Vatican to do the mining, then distribute the currency, continue mining it, and then make the software open source for other people to begin mining it for profit. The trick then, of course, is if anybody that wants to cause problems for the church has enough money, say another government, they could buy up a huge server farm that takes over 51% of the processing power on the network, and then fundamentally alter the way that the Catholic currency is working. And that kind of opens up the church to a lot of drama that they don't need to deal with these days.
Yeah, the liability is pretty huge there.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Look at the questions I had here for you. Yeah, so that covers the few things that I had pitched to you. For those who are listening, interesting note you mentioned earlier. Our relationship spans about 20 minutes prior to this podcast starting. We were chatting on a forum where actually it was on my Facebook post. We're just talking about. I asked a question about cryptocurrency, so I was listening to an interview, and someone had mentioned a Dominican friar working on some research with regard to cryptocurrencies, and I just sort of lobbed a question out into the ether of who was interested, and someone had mentioned your name, and we kind of started chatting. So,
yep. I got to give a shout out to Marcellino. I'm sure he wouldn't mind his name being on this podcast, but we'll see. He's an old college buddy of mine. I knew him for a couple of years when I was in college. I dropped out. He went on to graduate, I think. Yeah, he graduated. And then we didn't really talk to each other for a while. And then recently we all went to a wedding together because a mutual friend of ours got married. And we all realized that, hey, politically and ideologically, we're all in the same general ballpark. So we've been having a lot of fun conversations about liberty and its relationship to the church, and doctrine, and Catholic social teaching is something that comes up quite frequently because that's difficult to navigate these days.
Sure. Yeah, in that regard, is there anything in particular you're familiar with? I have scant knowledge at best of actual content and documents about work and about economics, and it's like very, very high level. Is there anything that you think is directly related to, either in support of or running counter to cryptocurrencies as a kind of thing? I mean, I know that any sort of economic exchange in principle is morally neutral insofar as it doesn't, run counter to some other sort of moral problem. But yeah, can you just talk about that a little bit?
Certainly. I don't know of the particular Dominican friar you're referencing. This is something that I want to look up, but I haven't had a chance.
Yeah,
I've been busy with life, but it's like, oh, okay, Dominican friar, cryptocurrency. There can't be too much that comes up with a Google result with those two search terms. I do know that modern Austrian economics ultimately finds its root in a Thomist monk named Nicholas Oresme. I think he was French, and I think he was 16th century, but it might be 17th century. I don't remember. But he wrote a series of, it had to have been 17th century, because he wrote a series of documents concerning the way that money operates based on human action. And so he effectively started what's called the field of praxeology, which is the study of human action, and is the basis of modern Austrian economics. And what was happening at the time politically was the discovery of the New World and a bunch of people coming over here and finding valuable metals and resources and bringing them back to Europe. And it was causing an inflationary spike in the value of currencies. So, Spain comes back with a bunch of silver. And so the amount of silver on the market suddenly goes up. So the supply goes up relative to the demand. So the individual value of any given silver dollar goes down. And so these kings were trying to figure out what was happening because nobody understood economics yet. And so they're like, I don't get it. I get more money and then my stuff is worth less. I don't know how that's happening. And so a bunch of people were writing to the kings and saying, well, this is something, I guess it works this way, or, oh, I guess that works that way. And a lot of it was kind of nationalist in its approach, where it's like, well, you're doing nothing wrong. But see, what's going on here is you're bringing all this gold and silver over here, and then it must be that dirty king next door that's debasing the currency in some way. And so you need to go invade them and stop them from ruining your currency, and that just compounds the problem. But Oresme kind of figured it out. He effectively took some existing thoughts that people had about supply and demand and really codified it in a way that he said, no, supply and demand is an observable phenomenon in the universe. And so as you increase the supply relative to the demand, the price is going to go down. You're inflating your currencies. So there's a responsible way to do this and an irresponsible way to do this.
Sure.
At the same time, there were kings that had less money in their treasury because they were spending it all to bankroll projects to cross the ocean. And so they had to find new ways of making money. So they start debasing their currency, start trimming the edges of their coins so they're worth a little less of that. They're actually made out of less of that precious metal. So they can take all the shavings and make more coins that are worth less than the actual amount. They start mixing metals together. And this is all stuff that Oresme addressed directly. And because he was a Thomist, I have issues with Thomism as a philosophical field of thought. But because he was a Thomist, a lot of it comes down to, well, it's the divine privilege and duty of the king to blah, blah, blah. And so he ought to do these things. But at the same time, he has more concrete, real kind of utilitarian arguments to back up his Thomistic arguments at the same time. So for me, I have more fun taking apart his utilitarian arguments than his Thomist ones, but that's just a personal thing for me. So if you're interested in kind of the history of economics and a baseline by which to look at the way that cryptocurrency operates, I would actually want to point to a 17th century monk and say Nicholas Oresme.
That's great.
As far as modern documents go, it's kind of difficult. One of the things that bothers me from a kind of catechetical angle is people say, what is the church's position on this thing? And I'm like, well, the church doesn't have positions. The church safeguards doctrines, right? The church safeguards the divinity of Christ. The church safeguards the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. We safeguard Mary's Immaculate Conception. We safeguard all these different doctrinal truths that are revealed to us. And then the rest are suggestions on how to navigate the world given the light of revelation and reason that we've been given. And at any given point in time, somebody may be more or less correct, unless they're speaking ex cathedra. And in that case they're working from doctrine as opposed to positions. So when a pope writes an encyclical, he's offering his opinion on something more than it's the church's position on something. So, you know, if you find the right priest in the right diocese or find the right cardinal within the Vatican, you can get all sorts of opinions that are not reflective of the church's understanding of doctrine. So asking what the church's position on something like cryptocurrency is would be similar to asking what the church's position is on global reserve currencies, on fiat currency, on all these different things. And the church, I think intelligently has avoided opining on the nature of fiat currency, right? The Federal Reserve has been around for over a century, and the Vatican has never issued a document talking, to my knowledge, the Vatican has never issued a document talking about the Federal Reserve directly.
Sure.
And I think, you know, it's a way to prevent political scandals like you have in the past with Galileo and witch burnings and stuff like that. And it's a way to maintain your authority on the things that you're authoritative about, right? Sure. If we're safeguarding doctrine, it kind of lessens our authority on doctrine if we start getting involved in political matters and then get proven wrong or have unfortunate outcomes from those political positions. Sure. Then it raises questions about doctrine.
Yeah, I would appreciate whenever I research anything and a friend will ask me, you know, what the church teaches about, like the way you had phrased it, and I guess the way I had phrased it too. And I typically respond initially by saying there will probably be a few, 2 or 3 outright rejections that will define the lay of the land and say there are 3 or 4 acceptable opinions, and then say none of them is acceptable to the exclusion of the other, or, you know, to the exclusion of the other, the one that we want to promote. So, you know, form your conscience and, you know, argue away. And typically to a T, anytime I research something, I'll find a couple of outright rejections and basically what I described. So yeah, I appreciate your explaining that nuance, because that happens a lot. Like, it's difficult to find any clear positions on things like this that are, you know, so tactical in nature. Like the way that you deal with a currency seems like it's not a first principle. It's a, you know, it's an outgrowth of many, many other things. So what, if I had to ask one more question before we end, what do you think the downsides are if we're like aiming right at the kind of practical? What are the downsides to, or why would you not want to accept cryptocurrencies as a parish? Sunday, looking at donations, pass around the bucket. Obviously, you can't drop a cryptocurrency. I mean, I guess you could. You could write it on a piece of paper, right?
Yeah.
You could live in that. So you could, or you could just remember the number, and then you could do that. But assume for a moment you don't have your coin on Post-it notes that you can give away. What would be the downsides? Why would you not do it as a parish?
So there's 2 things I can think of. The first one is the one that you brought up. There is something very ritualistic about taking your cash and putting it in the basket. There's something to it that, I mean, if I were a pastor and we had issues with people kind of reifying abstractions in the church, I would want to have them physically put their money in the basket from a pastoral perspective. If I were a pastor and people were making the opposite mistake, where they were kind of denying abstract realities, I would actually want them to pay with their credit card on a recurring payment process in order to help them think about the church in a more immaterial way. So it's kind of a pastoral approach. But for me, you know, again, I just transitioned to well, I'm in the process of transitioning to the Byzantine Catholic Rite. So in the Roman Rite, you know, you have a little bit of incense, you have some bells, you stand, you kneel, you stand, you kneel, you sit. In the Byzantine Rite, it's all bells and smells and kissing and touching and feeling, and it's very visceral. And so in the same way, you know, there's something very specific to taking that money, that physical object, and putting it in the basket. You're giving something away in a way that you're not doing with a digital exchange of goods. So there is something that I think might have a psychological impact on a parish that, you know, only time would be able to tell whether that had a net positive or negative impact on any one given parish. And it's kind of culturally based, right? It might be just easier to do in a place that doesn't have easy access to physical currency. Certain major cities in the Middle East, for example, like Dubai, it's almost all digital currency. So it would be difficult to go and get a physical currency to put in the basket at church. It would just be easier for everybody if you just use the digital currency. The second one is, this kind of comes from an anarchist angle, but also just from a practical look at things. Again, the church is a supranational entity, and so you don't want it to run afoul of any given government. Right. The last thing we need is an ongoing struggle between the local parishes and some federal government somewhere over some tax scheme, something or other. Right. So in the United States, the federal government can't make up its mind. There's so many different 3-letter acronyms in the administrative branch of the government that have different opinions about cryptocurrency that it's so schizophrenic you can't tell what the federal government's position on cryptocurrency is. Whereas like in China, they have their very clear-cut thing. They keep changing their mind, but this is the rule, and it keeps changing. There's other places in the world where cryptocurrency is rapidly becoming the default currency for people because the governments are so unreliable and so weak that they're not able to really effectively control the supply of currency. So in those places, I think it would be a net benefit to the church, again, to use the cryptocurrency because it helps separate them from the government. But like in America, you're always at risk where if your pastor says something that's unpopular, which a lot of Catholic doctrine is unpopular, then they could lose their tax-free status, right? They can lose all sorts of political privileges that they have been granted by the government. And so it opens you up to a certain tactical liability as opposed to any actual tangible liability when it comes to dealing with foreign governments. Yeah.
Do you know, assuming that most of the giving right now, I read a thing recently that I think it was in the Diocese of Dallas that Anthony and his brother had done for the diocese, talking about giving and about how they had done some analysis that most of the people that give are, I think, in their late 40s, 50s, and the younger group basically didn't give. And I assume that most of the people that give in that regard would give with actual, paper and checks. Do you have any idea right now, maybe in Denver, of what percentage of people give digitally versus not?
That's a good question. I don't know any of those metrics outright. Given how the Archdiocese of Denver operates, I'm thinking they probably have a rough estimate of those numbers, but I don't have access to them personally. I actually work for a Catholic parish in the Archdiocese of Denver, a Roman Catholic parish, and I'm the person that helps, one of my many jobs as a facilities manager is I escort the money counters when they go and retrieve all of the money from the vaults and the coin boxes and stuff like that. So I have a general idea of the composition of the donations, and it seems to be dollar for dollar checks is the big money giver. If you were to break it out into individual units, I think coins might be the case, but that includes putting the little quarter in the little votive candle box. That includes the pocket change that you just fish out of your pocket and throw in the basket. So I don't know if that's a good metric by which to try to measure things. I think dollar for dollar would be a better example. And it's definitely in favor of checks, at least at my particular parish in a wealthy neighborhood in Denver.
Fascinating. Yeah, it seems like having some understanding of the trends of money use in general, but in particular how it is now, how people tend to give money, at least in like the weekly offering, that would help get some idea of the trajectory of, any type of cryptocurrency in the future. If nothing else, you could, give from a direct bank transaction. So
yep, I do know that is a service that our parish offers, but the median age of people who actually come to church is somewhat on the older edge, and I think all this newfangled internet technology is too much for them. So checks are probably the way they're going to go. If any of our generation steps up to the plate and starts donating, which is a big initiative that my pastor's working on, or my boss, I should say. He's not my actual pastor, whatever. But the pastor of the parish is working on getting millennials to kind of step up to the plate and do their part. And so they do have that online ACS transaction process on the website. And I do know it's utilized, but it's definitely not the big dollar item on the spreadsheets.
Yeah, this is slightly off topic, but since we are talking about ways that parish raise money, I'm going to ask the question, see what you think. I was wondering in my mind, like I would wonder anywhere else. I was thinking about the potential for a parish to have a kind of funding mechanism that would operate kind of like a Patreon, where you would subscribe and you would, instead of like me needing to remember to bring a check and then write it because I need to give because I want to, support the church and all of her efforts. If you could subscribe, and then this is less dealing with cryptocurrencies, in some way have a passive reception of what the church gives you, like if they record homilies or if there's some sort of the idea of a subscription model instead of I need to remember like emotionally to get engaged again and write a check every week, if that resonates with you in any way.
It does. One of my big kind of complaints these days, working for a parish and just in general looking at the church, is that the church has tried to divorce itself from economic accountability, and unfortunately it's something that you can't do. In the past, this is something that the church has actually been really good at, operating within economic frameworks. For instance, until recently, until I was born, basically, a majority of the hospitals and schools were staffed by nuns and friars. Yeah. And the reason is that they had vows of poverty. So you don't have to pay them, right? You keep a roof over their head, you give them food, and they will show up to work every day and they will do their job, and it's great. But then as there are fewer and fewer vocations available, all these hospitals and schools have to start hiring lay people who have families, who have insurance, who have all these different things they need to get paid. And so the quality of the work has diminished as the ability to pay for that work has diminished. And so now, you have the hospitals overrun by state agents. You have the hospitals that are no longer market viable on the free market or the control command market that we have today. Same with the schools, right? I have a parish school that's attached to my parish that I also manage from a facilities angle, and they're having issues with tuition. And the reason is they have to pay all these teachers, where before it was all nuns. They have like 4 nuns that work there now. It's run by a nun, but I mean, that's unusual for the Archdiocese of Denver. I think them and a high school down the street are the only schools that really have nuns working at them anymore.
Yeah.
So we're not divorced from economic accountability in a way that the church likes to sometimes think it is. The way that this relates to giving and stuff is, especially in the postmodern age, but even throughout history, what we do when we take money and put it in the basket is we're actually paying for a service. Whether that be the price of redemption for our immortal soul, or the warm fuzzies that I feel for helping somebody, or the development of particular virtue within my own person. There's a million different things that we're buying when we put the money in the basket. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. There's always some sort of incentive. I mean, this is my modern philosophical training coming out, my reading of the Continentals.
Sure, yeah.
But I don't think there is any such thing as altruism. Setting up some sort of subscriber program for an actual tangible service. For instance, we have all of the pastors, all of the priests' homilies available on the website, but after the first month, it goes behind a paywall. You have to be a Patreon subscriber or whatever to get access to archived footage. What that does is 2 things. One is it helps keep people engaged in that if I pay this monthly subscription, I'm more likely to take advantage of those recordings because I'm paying for them. I'm emotionally attached to them now. Yeah. And then the second is it costs money to run a server. It costs money to keep this stuff hosted on the website. It costs money to pay for the priest. Otherwise, we would have more priests because, again, economic incentives. Yeah. So
for the building, I'm an architect. So I deal with the architecture of the church all the time.
So yeah, we operate in the same neighborhood. This is cool. But yeah, so there's a bunch of costs associated with it, and putting money in the basket is great, but it's unreliable. Some months you'll get a lot, some months you won't get a lot. You have to kind of average it out over the year, kind of project what you're operating at, and it's fine. But then the people that are putting the money in the basket might just be doing it because that's what you do culturally, as opposed to actually purchasing a service. So if you have put the money in the basket and get an online subscription for the homilies. If you want to add an extra $1 a month or $1 a content item or whatever, you might be able to get like RCIA remedial catechesis classes or something.
Sure.
Like NFP courses hosted on the website. You know, you could build a whole set of digital and tangible services that you get access to through a capitalist transaction of goods, in addition to the charity, which is separate. So I can't say, oh, I'm subscribed to the website, so now I don't have to put money in the basket. Those are two different forms of stewardship. And so that's something that the pastor would have to be very involved in making sure that the development of his parishioners' consciences coincide with the virtue of charity and stewardship and the virtue of capitalism.
Sure, yeah, and that's a communication thing primarily, because if you don't explain clearly what the distinction between those two is, then you could think, oh, I've like bought the product, therefore, done my duty, and that's clearly not the model that you're proposing.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. So you're in Denver, you said?
I am.
That's awesome. Yeah. I just met some people from Denver recently through the D'Ambrosios at a conference, and yeah, I like everyone I've met from Colorado. So
that's good. Might be a small sample size, but it's good that you like people from Colorado, generally speaking.
Sure, yeah.
Excellent.
Well, I don't have any more questions for you, so.
Okay, well, it was nice to meet you, and this was a great conversation. Thank you. Yeah. I always need motivation to get content up on my site, so I'll get this put together, and I'll actually throw it in that Catholic Creatives group so that everybody can partake of our wisdom.
Yeah. Thanks for dealing with my really amateurish and somewhat unformed questions. I appreciate it.
Those are the best kind, to be entirely honest. So, well, thank you very much. Carpe Veritas, and have a great week.
Yeah.